I'll show you how to take your table from boring to beautiful with this Halloween hexagon table topper. I'll show you how easy it is to whip up next. Alright guys, the things you're going to need to make this Halloween hexagon table topper are 6 different Halloween prints, and you want to cut 2.5 by the width of the fabric of each fabric. And the length on these is usually about 44 inches, but each fabric varies. You're going to need about a yard of backing fabric, and I'm going to use this cute leaf print. That way when Halloween's over, I could flip this over and use it for Thanksgiving or just for fall. You're going to need about a yard of batting. I'm out of batting actually right now, so I'm just going to use this flannel here that I have. Since most of my prints are darker color, this print won't even show through. And actually, when I make a table topper, I like using flannel for the batting because I think they lay flatter on the table. And finally, you're going to need some binding. You could use whatever binding you like. I prefer to use 2.5-inch strips. You'll also need your sewing machine, some coordinating thread. You're also going to need some kind of quilting ruler that has a 60-degree line on it. Let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is take our 2.5-inch strips. Like I said, we did cut 2 from each fabric. We're going to lay the matching sets together with the right sides facing each other. And with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, we're going to sew these together. And you want to do that for all of your strips. Now we should have 6 long strips. The next thing you want to do is we're going to take this over to our ironing board, and we want to open these and press the seams open, and you want to do that for all 6 of your strips. Now you just want to lay out your fabric in the order that you like. I just happen to like this layout that just kind of happened by accident, so I'm going to stick with this. So our next step is we're going to sew these all together. So we're going to take our first 2 strips here. We're going to fold the second one on top of the first one, and using a 1/4-inch seam allowance, we're going to sew all the way down our strips. And more than likely they're not going to match up at the end, but that's totally fine. And it should look something like this. Now we're just going to take this over to our ironing board, and we're going to press our seam over to the pumpkin side. It doesn't really matter which side you press your seam as long as all your seams go the same direction. Alright guys, I have my seam pressed over to the pumpkin side. Now our next step is we're going to take our 3rd strip here. We're going to line it up with the edge of the pumpkin fabric, and with the same 1/4-inch seam allowance, we're going to sew this strip on. And now we're just going to take this over to our ironing board, and we're going to press our seam over to the spiderweb fabric. Alright, now we're just going to continue adding our strips one at a time until all 6 are sewed together. Now that you have all 6 of your strips sewed together, you just want to go back and give it a really good press. On both sides. And make sure that your seams are all running the same direction. So now that we have everything pressed nice and flat, you want to take your ruler that has a 60-degree angle mark on it, and we're going to line up the edge of our fabric here at the top with our 60-degree mark, and then we're going to line up the bottom of our ruler with the corner of our fabric. And since I have a little bit of the selvage edge here, I'm just going to line it up right after the selvage. And you can see it starts to form one side of a triangle. Now with your rotary cutter, just give it a cut. And this is just scrap. For our next cut, we're going to line our 60-degree line up with our edge we just cut. And we're going to line up our ruler right here at the point. And just cut that. And now we have 1/5 of our table topper. For our next cut, we're going to line up the 60-degree line with our top. Match our ruler down here to the corner. And just slice it off. Now you want to do that until you have 5 pieces. Now that we have our 6 triangles cut out, you should have 3, in my case, with this orange spider fabric on the top, and 3 with the orange spider fabric at the bottom. Now we just want to lay it out. So first I'm going to put 1 with the orange spider fabric here at the top. Then take one of the ones with the spider fabric here at the bottom and lay it next to that. Then just keep alternating your triangles. Just like that. Now you just want to take your first triangle here. We're going to lay it over on the triangle next to it. And we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, I like to pin the seams here to make sure that they match up when I'm finished. So to do that, you just want to nestle your seams together here and put a pin. And I do that in every seam. Alright guys, now that we have these 2 pieces sewed together, now you just want to take this 3rd piece over here, and we're going to lay it over. Match up our seams, pin it, and sew this piece together. Now you just want to do the same thing with these 3 pieces. Now that our 2 sides are sewed together, our next step is you just want to take the top one, fold it over the bottom one, and just like the other pieces, we're going to match up all these seams, put a pin, and sew it together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you just want to set this off to the side a minute and grab your backing piece of fabric. You want to lay it so the pretty side of your fabric is facing down. Make sure you give it a good press to get out any creases or wrinkles, and you just want to smooth it flat. Next, grab your batting, and in my case it's this flannel here. Now I have a print on this flannel, so I'm going to put it face down towards this darker fabric just so it doesn't show through. And you want to make sure that that's nice and flat also. Now just lay your table topper right on top, and you guessed it, smooth it flat. Now at this point I like to take some safety pins here, and I'm going to pin it on every other section here just to make sure that's really good, flat, and stable. And you just want to smooth it out and pin. Now that I have this side, I'm going to go down on the opposite side and do the same thing. Now that it's all pinned together, I'm just going to go ahead and trim around this excess fabric, leaving about 2 inches all the way around. Now our next step is I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to quilt these layers together. Now how much you want to quilt this is totally up to you. I've seen people do like a spider web design or all over quilting, but since I want this to be reversible, I'm just going to go ahead and just stitch in the ditch around each of these hexagons. Alright guys, I have this all quilted together here. Now our next step is we're going to trim this down to size. Now I just like to grab my ruler here. I'm going to line up this seam here with the 2 1/4 inch mark on my ruler. And then just trim off the excess. Now there might be a little bit of the batting showing here, but that's okay because that will just get covered with our binding. Now you just want to spin the table topper and do that all the way around. Alright guys, so now our last step we're going to do here is we're going to do the binding. There are many different ways that you could do your binding, but I'm going to show you how I do mine. So for our binding here, I cut 3 2.5 strips by the width of the fabric, and we're just going to want to sew these together. You could just sew them together like our other strips by placing them right sides together and sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here, but it tends to get really bulky here. So what I like to do is with the right sides facing, I like to lay them together just like that, making sure this top edge lines up with this bottom, and the top edge here lines up with this side, and just put a couple pins to hold it in place. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew from this corner here at a diagonal all the way over to this corner. Just like that. And now you just want to cut off this extra fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now when you see when we open this up, we have one continuous strip. And when we make our binding, our seam will be evenly spaced and it won't have a big bulky knot right here in the middle. Now this table topper will probably only take 2 strips of fabric, but I'm just going to add a 3rd just in case. Now that we have our binding strips sewed together, our next step is to take this over to our ironing board. We're just going to fold this in half, give it a good press the whole length of our strip. Just like this. Now I like to start my binding here on the back, and I like to leave an 8-inch opening here to help join my binding later. So since this is 12 inches, I'm going to come in 2 inches. I'm going to put a pin right here, and then one over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here at this pin. I'm going to sew my binding on all the way around, and I'm going to stop here at this pin. And this 8 extra inches here will give me enough fabric and enough wiggle room to sew my 2 pieces of binding together. So now you want to line up the 2 raw edges with the edge of your fabric here, and make sure you have a long enough tail. I'm just going to do an 8-inch tail here because I know I have plenty of fabric. So I'm going to take this pin out, I'm going to stick it back on here. So using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to start sewing on my binding. And I'll show you how I do the corners to get a nice pretty mitered corner on these angles. Alright guys, so I'm here at my sewing machine. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew on this binding. And you just want to make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end. My first pin was right here, but I took it out because I'm going to start sewing. Now to get a pretty mitered corner here, you want to find the halfway point between this angle right here. This table topper makes it really easy because there's a seam right there. So what I like to do is feel for the seam and then just make a mark with my chalk. Now I'm just going to sew right up to that line. Now that I hit the mark, I'm going to stop with my presser foot down. I'm going to lift my presser foot, spin my project, and I'm going to sew right off the edge there following my chalk line. You can see I started my binding here. I stopped where my chalk line was and went off the fabric. Now you just want to pull your binding back. And it looks like I could have went a little bit farther forward here, but it should be okay. You want to make it even with your next side, and then we're going to fold it over. Just like that. Now I like to put a clip there just to hold it in place. And you can see there's this little flap here. That's what you want. Now I'm going to take this back over to my sewing machine, and starting right here at the edge with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to continue down attaching my binding until I get to the next corner. So since I have this already out here, I'm just going to feel for that seam line, and it's right here. So I'm going to sew until I hit that, pivot, and sew off the project. Now like I said, we're just going to start right off the edge here. And with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're just going to keep sewing. So I reached my chalk line. I'm going to stop with my needle down, pivot, and sew off the project. Now you just want to lay your binding back so it's even with your next seam here. It's a little awkward on my sewing machine. We're going to fold that over so that the corner here matches the corner in the back. And with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just keep sewing. And you just want to continue that all the way around until you get to your last pin. Alright guys, so I have my binding all the way sewed around. As you can see, you definitely only need 2 pieces of binding here. So I'm going to clip this off. Now to attach these together, since I'm using a 2.5 inch strip, we want to overlap our binding with our other piece of binding by 2.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up this piece of binding with my mark down here on my grid. I'm going to lay this one over top, come over 2.5 inches, and just snip it off. So what we're going to do is open this one with our right sides facing up, and then we want to open this one with our right sides facing down. You may have to fold over your table topper a little bit, and we're going to line them up just like that, so the top edge here matches the side, and our side edge here matches the top of the bottom strip. And then you definitely want to give it a pin or 2. Now we're just going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to sew from corner to corner. Now you just want to trim that off, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now you can see when we open it up, we have just the right amount of binding to finish off our table topper. Now you just want to take this back over to your sewing machine, making sure you backstitch at the beginning and the end, and just sew that little section closed. Now you just want to flip this over. I like to flip the binding over. Now finally, we just need to sew down the front of our binding. So what I do is I just flip this over, I match the edge of my binding, and just go over my previous stitch line just a hair, and I like using a zigzag stitch. You could use a straight stitch, or you could hand sew this down, but really you won't even notice that there is a zigzag stitch. So what I do is I like to zig on the fabric and just come off the edge of the binding onto your table topper just a little bit. And that way we also cover our stitch line back here. When you get to the corner, you just want to fold it straight off the edge like that. And then just fold this side over. And you can see you have a nice mitered corner here at the edge. Like I said, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch, and as always, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And now our Halloween hexagon table topper is finished. This will add a spooky touch to any table. I hope you give this project a try. If you like this video and want to see more of my videos, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the big red subscribe button down below. If you like this video and learned something, share it across your social medias. If you have a question about this video or any of my other videos, feel free to leave a comment. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.